We are filming for the Hamilton College Jazz Archive on the Hamilton campus today. It's a great pleasure for me to have saxophonist, clarinetist, arranger, composer, and on the eve of receiving an honorary degree from Hamilton, Bob Wilber. Welcome.
Thank you, Mug. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to speak to you. And last night I was watching a video that you were in with a big band.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. And you were saying that your first love was big band, but your career started just a tad late.
Yeah, well, I grew up in the, I was 70 in March, so in the late 30s and early 40s, of course, it was the big band era, and the music was in the air. It was on the radio all the time, and that was my first love was, particularly on clarinet, was certainly Benny Goodman. Mm-hmm. It was truly the king of swing. I mean, he really was. It just wasn't a name.
It just wasn't a platitude that was given.
No. When they called Paul Whiteman the king of jazz in the 20s, that was a platitude. But Benny Goodman was the king of swing. Mm-hmm. He was certainly my first great influence.
When you got to be old enough to start gigging professionally, then it was more of a small ensemble opportunity.
Definitely, sure. Yeah. When I actually was starting to get out there professionally playing, we're talking about 1946, 47, 48, this is when the whole big band thing fell apart, partially for economic reasons and partially because you had a whole new generation of young people coming up and it wasn't their thing. You know, young people are always searching for their thing. And by then we were having things like Bill Haley's Comets and the beginnings of what became rock and roll, I suppose. Yeah. And economically, it just wasn't feasible for these bands to be traveling all over the country anymore.
You also had the start of bop.
Yeah.
Was there a particular reason that you were more attracted to the quote classic jazz than bop?
Well, I don't know quite how to answer that. My first love was of course, the big bands, and by the early 40s, I was fairly sophisticated in my taste. I loved Ellington, Goodman, Artie Shaw. I was realizing that there was the hot swing bands, and then there was the more commercial bands. By that time, I had listened to Glenn Miller for a couple of years, and he was a little too commercial for my taste. You know, I was quite bored with In the Mood by then. But my discovery of earlier jazz really was because the big companies, Columbia and Victor, started reissuing the old records of Louis Armstrong, Jello Roll Morton, Bix Beiderbecke, the people of the 20s. So I went backwards from the swing era to discover the roots, and I was always interested in history. And so I wanted to know, well, how did this come about and where did it come from? And of course, it naturally led me back to the earlier movement. I remember listening to the reissue Armstrong's Hot Five, and at that time, to me, the greatest trumpet player in the world was Harry James. That was undoubtedly, you know, hands down, no question about it. And I was totally puzzled by the Hot Five. It was so complex, this music, with the trumpet and the clarinet and the trombone with these interweaving lines, you know. It took me a long time to understand it. Big band music with the riffs and everything was much simpler. But the more I listened to Louis, I realized this is where Harry James comes from, and this is the man. And once I discovered that Louis Armstrong was the greatest, I never changed my opinion. He still is the greatest, you know. So, but I was intrigued by Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. I remember the first record I got of them was Groovin' High, and what was the other side? I can't remember. Anyway, and Salt Peanuts came out at that time.
Yeah.
A bunch of us in our gang, we thought it was very clever, you know, and the musicianship was obviously great, but it didn't have the soul that we felt in the music of Armstrong and of Bechet and Goodman too. it was clever, but it didn't hit us in our heart. It hit us in our head. We appreciated what they were doing intellectually.
Do you felt that their music was kind of introverted, more towards just for the musician?
I felt that. I remember the first time that I heard Dizzy and Charlie on the street. It was during the war, and these servicemen were coming back from the service, and they'd gone away remembering maybe Glenn Miller or Benny Goodman and everything, and they were back in New York in 52nd Street, and they were raring to go, you know. And they're sitting at the bar in this club where Charlie and Dizzy were playing, and I remember the band playing Groovin' High. And they're not hearing a melody that they recognized, and they weren't happy, and they had a few beers, and they were getting angry, and there was a hostility going on, and Charlie and Dizzy were standing there saying, you know, this is what we play. If you don't like it, the hell with you, you know. And I felt this hostility, and it was a new feeling to me in jazz, because jazz to me was where everybody in the joint was having a ball, you know, and the joint was jumping, you know. And it kind of upset me. Although I realized they were great musicians, I felt this lack of communication between the musicians and the audience.
Too much intellectual, not enough soul, perhaps.
Yeah, and there was an aggression in their attitude towards the audience, which was very different. The idea of entertaining the audience, they were rebelling against that concept.
Louis Armstrong certainly never rebelled
didn't.
against that.
No, not at all. He was a great entertainer. In fact, his ability to be a marvelous entertainer, in a way, sort of got in the way of musicians being able to appreciate his music, you know. So a lot of musicians of that era, the young musicians, they wouldn't take Armstrong seriously, you know, because they weren't acquainted with the groundbreaking things he did in the 20s, of course, which was absolutely revolutionary. I mean, Armstrong really, in a sense, invented swing. He was the first jazz musician to realize the how to swing perfectly, you know, every bar. Other musicians of his contemporaries and the earlier musicians, Oliver, they'd play a couple of phrases that would be great, then they'd play another phrase that would be awkward, you know. And Jelly Roll had some ragtime in his playing, but he was a perfect swing player. He never played a phrase that didn't swing, you know. To me, he, Bechet, and a few others, they invented swing. And that was their music was the basis for the whole swing era of the 30s. You know.
You came to the clarinet in a kind of funny way. I had, of course, the advantage of listening to you just a little while ago.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I loved music as a kid, but the reason I wanted to play something was because I liked the idea of playing in the band. Of course, in those days, the football team was the big thing, and every Friday afternoon you had the football game. And if the football team was playing out of town, you'd get out of class early and go on the bus to the neighboring town, and then you'd watch the whole game right from the sidelines there. And then during the half, you get out there and play. You know, that sounded great. So anyway, I went up to the music department, and this was, you know, just when we had started school, and I suppose must have been in 7th grade, my first year in junior high. And I said, I want to play in the band. And so the director said, well, okay, son, what would you like to play? I said, I think maybe a trumpet would be great, you know. And so he said, well, you take this horn, and you borrow it over the weekend, you bring it back Monday, and try it out. So I took the trumpet home, and oh boy, and I fingered these valves and everything. And then I started to blow into it. Nobody had told me you have to spit into a trumpet. I didn't know, you know. So I just blew so hard and nothing came out. So Monday I took the horn back. I said, no, the trumpet, it's just not me, you know. So the next weekend I said, let me try something else. And he said, well, how about a clarinet? Okay, swell. Took the clarinet home, and I started playing it as soon as I got home Friday afternoon. By Sunday afternoon, I could play Row, Row, Row Your Boat on the clarinet. Dun, 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 dun. I said, this is it.
Right.
Perfect. And I've never looked back.
All right.
I'm still trying to play Row, Row Your Boat.
At what point did you learn how to play over the break?
Ah, well, that took a little while.
Yeah.
That took a little while.
Right.
But no, I just, and at that point, I already loved Benny Goodman. So I said, Jesus, maybe I could play like Benny, you know. And I started, luckily my teacher at high school was the band director was also an excellent clarinetist. That was his main instrument. He started me off with the standard exercises and books that any classical clarinet starts on. You know, he's a good teacher. At the same time, I was listening to jazz. I was discovering, besides Benny Goodman, I was going back and discovering Johnny Dodds, who played with Louis Armstrong, Frank Teschmaker, all these different players. So when I was 14, I was ready to go on the clarinet. Luckily, in my school, in Scarsdale High School, outside New York, there was a group of young guys who were interested in playing jazz, and they were, in most of them, maybe 2 or 3 years older. I knew about them, and so I was really excited. And the only way I could figure out how to get to play with them was I knew that they were always looking for a place to have a jam session, you know. So I plucked up my courage and called one of these guys and said, I know you guys be, you know, looking for a place to play. Well, my father said, you can come over and play Sunday afternoon at our house, and we got a good piano. And they said, oh, great, great. So, of course, they came over, and they were jamming, and I came downstairs with my clarinet, you know. And, oh, you play clarinet too, huh, kid? Oh, come on, join us, you know. So I played with them, and I was in, you know.
That's great.
I was Kid Wilbur.
Kid Wilbur.
Kid Wilbur, yeah.
It's almost like inviting your friends to play baseball because you have the ball.
That's
right?
it. It's the same thing. So that
Well,
started it.
What a better place to learn than with your peers, you know, and learn on the spot.
Well, of course, in those days we had 52nd Street, which was this marvelous block between 5th and 6th Avenue, which had, at any given time, there was at least 4 or 5 different jazz clubs. They'd often change names and management and so forth. But it was a great place to hear music. We had Nick's in the Village, where the group of players that associated with Eddie Condon played. Pee Wee Russell, Max Kaminsky, Bobby Hackett, Brad Gowans, the whole so-called Chicago style. There was a lot of live music happening. Of course, the big bands were going great. All the major hotels had bands. Tommy Dorsey would be at the Astor. Benny Goodman would be at the Mad Hatton Room. Which hotel was that? Glenn Miller. All the bands, you know. And there was air shots. Every band, every evening there was air shots. 15 minutes from here, 15 minutes from Chicago, 15 minutes. It was just in the air, you know. So there was plenty of opportunity to hear music. I started hanging out in 52nd Street the first time that my pal, Denny Strong, who was a drummer in our little group, went in there. We had told our parents we were going up to White Plains to watch a movie, go to a movie, you know. And instead of going to White Plains, we took the train into town, you know. And we started out in the Village, and then we took the subway up to 52nd Street, and we were going from club to club. And suddenly we looked at our watch, and oh my God, we've only got 10 minutes to make that 1 o'clock train at Grand Central back to Scarsdale. We ran as fast as we could. Of course, we missed the train. So Denny says, what are we going to do, Bob? I said, well, let's go back to 52nd Street. What the heck? So we went back, and that was the most exciting experience of walking into Kelly's stable where Coleman Hawkins was playing. And it must have been by then 2:33 in the morning. Practically empty, just nobody there, maybe, you know, a few people. And and the waiter said, "Oh, boys, yeah, what do you?" said, "Oh, right up next to the bandstand." So we were sitting on a little table as close as I am to you. The band was on playing away, and we looked around, and there's Coleman Hawkins coming down the aisle. And he gets on the stand, picks up his tenor. I remember one of the guys in the band said, what do you want to play, Hawk? He said, Body, 1, 2. He started playing Body and Soul, you know. And here's Denny and Ira sitting there. And there's Coleman Hawkins, one of our idols, playing, you know, Body and Soul. That was very exciting.
I should say so.
Can you imagine? Yeah.
Did your parents let you out again?
Well, anyway, so of course, we went back to the station, and I remember sleeping on one of those marble benches.
Oh.
And we woke up, and people were going into work. We caught the first train out, 6:30 or 6:45, and we're out in Scarsdale. And I go home, and I take my shoes off and sneak into the house and upstairs, and I go past my parents' room, and, "Is that you, son?" Yeah, Dad, it's me, yeah. Well, where have you been? And I had to tell him, you know. So by then they began to realize that I was absolutely hooked on jazz, totally. Yeah.
Yeah. Did your parents encourage you to have a safety net?
Yeah, well, my father was came from a small town in Ohio, and he went to college and went on to get a master's degree and came to New York and went into textbook publishing, and he was very successful at it. And of course, in being in that field, he knew all the professors in all the universities, and he really would have liked me to go on to one of the Ivy League schools, you know. So I guess when I was about 16, we began to go around, and we were going around to the colleges, and he'd introduce me to the various professors and everything. By age of 16, I was hooked on jazz, and I said, "This is very nice, Dad, and Princeton is lovely, you know, campuses, but no, this doesn't feel right for me." So he said, "Okay, well, look, we'll go up to Eastman School in Rochester, because they handle all the Eastman textbooks." So I went up there, and I met Howard Hanson, the principal, and all this. So finally, I ended up going to Eastman, okay? Go there the first term, and it's a very good school and everything, but gosh, I miss jazz. There's nothing happening. And so I went home for Christmas. So my father says, "Son, how's it going?" I said, "Well, Dad, you know, it's a great school. It really is, and I'm learning a lot." I said, "But I don't think I want to go back after the first term." He says, "Son, what do you want to do with your life? You want to be a musician? What do you want to do?" I said, "Well, Dad, you know that block in New York, 52nd Street between 5th and 6th Avenue, you know, with all the clubs?" "Oh, yeah, I know, that's where you've been going." I said, "Well, Dad, I just want to hang around and listen to all these great musicians. Maybe I'll meet them, maybe get a chance to sit in and play with them." And he says, "Son, you want to spend the rest of your life blowing your lungs out in smoky dives?" I said, yeah, that's what I wanted to do." Anyway, I mean, I must give him credit. He could understand my passion for music, because he was a piano player, and he played for his own amusement all his life. And he was a good musician. He had a good ear. He could fake anything. And he had some knowledge of jazz. He loved Teddy Wilson's piano. He'd bought some of the albums. And he took the whole family, I guess it was around 1942, to Cafe Society to hear Teddy Wilson's band. You know. And that was a great experience for a kid of, I think, 28, 14, you know. And then the next great experience was he took the whole family to Carnegie Hall in 1943 for Duke Ellington's first concert, where they premiered Black, Brown, and Beige. I'm on stage in these beautiful gray tuxedos with burgundy cummerbunds, and Duke comes on in tails and everything, and then he came on the second half. He changed from black tails to white tails, you know. And the instruments were so polished and burnished. And the music, I mean, it was so exciting. I remember one experience that amused me. My grandmother was maybe 83 at the time, and she had been an organist in my father's church all her life, and she appreciated music. She knew nothing about jazz at all. But we're sitting there, and Tricky Sam Nanton comes down front with his plunger, and he does one of his ya solos. And Gonka, my grandmother, turns to me and says, "Bob, he's trying to tell us something." I said, "You're so right, Gran. You're so right." So she got the message. She said, "This guy's saying something to us, you know."
It's a great story.
Yeah.
Now, you managed to get your own group together in high school,
Yeah.
the Wildcats.
Yeah, I was playing with these older fellows, and then I gradually found out about other musicians around the county. Eddie Fife was in Larchmont, and up in Greenwich, Connecticut, there was a piano player, Dick Wellston, and a bass player, Charlie Traeger. And out of this group, we'd have jam sessions to get together. We got a group together that we called ourselves the Wildcats, and we started playing around, and we all went down to Jimmy Ryan's for one of their Sunday sessions. And we got friendly with Milt Gabler, who was the founder of Commodore Records, had the Commodore Music Shop. And we kept bugging Milt. We'd be down every Sunday. "Milt, hey, man, we got a little band. Can't we get up and just play one number?" "Oh, don't bother us, kid. You know, come on, just sit down and listen to music." Finally, he said, "Okay, you guys, I got a little opening here. Get up there and play a little bit, you know." So we got up there, and it was a sensation. The people loved it. And he said, "You kids are all right, you know." So he let us come back and play. And then he said, "You know, you kids are really, really something else. I'd like to record you for Commodore." So this was a great opportunity. I remember we took about 6 hours to record four titles. I mean, we were so nervous. Now this is history. This is going back to the era when you still had wax discs. You know, 1947, you still had a wax disc with that stylus that cut the disc, and that red light went on, and you had 3 minutes, and that's it. If you made a mistake, you spoil it. There's no splicing tapes together, none of that. So we made 4 sides, and then at that point is when I started studying with Sidney Bechet, of course.
There was a comment in one of the jazz books that said it was the first American revival group of consequence in the East, talking about the Wildcats.
Yeah, yeah.
And did you know you were doing revival at the time?
Well, in a sense we did, because we were immersed in the music of King Oliver, Jello Morton, Armstrong, Hot Five, and we wanted to play in that style. We didn't want to imitate their records. We wanted to play in their style, but be creative at the same time. And yeah, in a sense, it was quite different from the traditional jazz that was happening around New York at that time. I mean, that was mostly centered around the Eddie Condon group and Pee Wee Russell and those guys, who were doing their own thing, but it was quite different than what we were doing. So it was unique.
Is it possible to put into words what was different about the Condon style and the style that you were emulating?
It's very hard to describe the difference. The Condon style was a group of musicians who were kids growing up in Chicago in the 20s, listening to King Oliver, Armstrong, the Dodds Brothers, and being totally knocked out and inspired by that music, and in their own way playing something which was, they thought was like it, but it turned out different. And it's what we kids were doing. We were inspired by the records of the same musicians that they had heard in person. We were inspired by the recordings and trying to emulate that sound. So we thought of ourselves as the new Austin High gang.
Yeah.
You know?
Did you at the time think it valuable to pick out certain clarinet solos and really learn how to play them note for note.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciated Goodman, but he was too far beyond. It was too difficult. It was more than I could possibly comprehend. But Bechet, when I discovered Bechet, this was after I knew about Goodman. Some of the things he did were simpler and more able to. I was more able to learn the solos and try to develop my own way of playing, but in his style. What happened the first time we went to the recording studio to record for Commodore, I walk in the studio, and Milt Gabler looks at me, and I just have my clarinet. He says, "Where's your soprano, man?" I said, oh no, Milt, I'm not ready on that soprano yet." "Oh no, you're supposed to have your soprano. Come on, you're Sidney Bechet's student." He was really mad, you know. But I just felt I wasn't ready to tackle that soprano, because this, you know, Bechet was the master. So I started out in clarinet and gradually developed the soprano. The same thing happened with the alto. I worshiped Johnny Hodges, you know, but it was for years before I could bring myself to really tackle the alto, because it was just too far beyond
That's
me.
a pretty mature attitude, I think, at that young age.
Yeah.
For someone who, you know, in your eyes probably was pretty powerful, a record man, you know, and he's saying, "Bring that horn," and you're going, "I'm not ready to do that yet."
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. It shows a great respect for the music.
Well, the same thing happened when, you remember the famous Louis Armstrong 1947 Town Hall concert, which was the concert which was the basis for the Louis Armstrong All-Stars. In other words, from Louis switching from the big band format to a small band format. I was living with Sidney at the time in Brooklyn, and so the concert was one of those 5:30 starts at Town Hall Saturday afternoon. So I said to Sid, "I think I'll go in town and catch a movie this afternoon. So I'll see you backstage at Town Hall, you know, around 5 o'clock." So I go to the movie, and I go over to Town Hall, and the promoter, Ernie Anderson, and Fred Robbins, who was the big jazz disc jockey at the time, they're running around and say, "Where's Bechet? Where's Bechet?" "Bob, you live with, where is he?" I said, "I don't know, he was coming over and meeting us backstage here." "Well, he's not here, we're planning the show. I mean, what are we going to do?" And Ernie says, "Look, if he doesn't show, you got to go on his place." I said, "Ernie, I'm not ready for that. This is a band with Armstrong, Hackett, Jack Teagarden, Big Sid Catlett, Bob Haggart. I'm not ready for this yet, you know. No, I can't. I just can't." So anyway, the concert went ahead, and it was a big success. It was recorded, and the promoters, they had to beg Joe Glazer to let them use Louis without his whole band. He was dead set against it. You know, "You want Louis Armstrong? You got to take the whole band." "Oh, we just want Louis. This is one concert." Well, anyway, Glazer saw the tremendous applause and appreciation of Louis playing with a small band. Of course, being a businessman, he thought, 6 musicians rather than 15, you know, so forth. And that's when he put together the Armstrong All-Stars, because of that one concert. But again, I was not, I felt I wasn't ready, and of course I wasn't ready. So I think I did the right thing.
How did Sidney Bechet feel about his own place in jazz history?
Well, at the time that I first got to know Sidney, his feeling was that the music had passed him on, and that the young musicians weren't interested in his kind of music. He was very flattered by my interest in his music, and he had this feeling of wanting to pass on what he had learned and the music in New Orleans and everything. So, but his idea was, in starting this music school, which was he started in early 1947, was to sort of have the school and a few students and maybe play a few concerts around New York, but in a sense be in semi-retirement, really.
Yeah.
So he had not the slightest idea of what was going to happen with his career when he went to France in 1949, where he played that first concert in Paris. He was an overnight smash hit. He went on the plane with Charlie Parker, who was what all the French critics were talking about. Charlie Parker's coming to Paris. Oh, fantastic, you know. Well, Charlie went on first, and Bechet went on the second half, and that was it.
Oh.
The French people, I mean, they just took Bechet to their heart. And he came back after a week. He couldn't believe it. And he says, oh, it was fantastic. Started going back, and of course he ended up living there really for 10 years, making records that were sold in the millions.
What did a lesson with Sidney Bechet consist of? Did you listen to recordings or just play back and forth?
No, he never used recordings in lessons. He would sit on this piano stool at this big upright piano, and he had his horn there, and he had the keyboard, and I'd sit in this chair like I am now, and I think the first thing he talked about, he said, well, let's take a song, and I'll show you how you present it. And he started playing Rockin' Chair on the piano. He had a way of playing the piano. It was a very basic technique, but it sounded like Bechet when he played the piano.
Mm.
It had his personality, you know. And he had this marvelous harmonic sense where he heard sounds and he heard inner voices and everything. But his whole thing was, you got to tell a story. That was it, you know. You present the melody, and you play it in such a way that people say, oh, what a beautiful song that is, you know. He says, then you start to introduce variations, but keep going back to the melody. Don't get too far away. And then you start developing it and everything. And then you build it up, and then at the end, you come back to the melody again and bring it right down. Tell a story. That was
marvelous.
Very important.
Yeah. And pull the listener with you gradually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he'd explain about jazz rhythm. He says, jazz rhythm, you got that steady beat going here. And then you introduce rhythms against the steady beat. That's what jazz is. Boom, boom, dun, 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 dun. You know, that's what you got to do. That steady beat, and then those rhythms against it.
Cool.
He had a very strong idea of what he was doing. He considered himself an artist from the earliest days. You know, he went to France with Will Marion Cook's Southern Syncopated Orchestra in 1919. Not as a sideman in the band. He was a soloist. He only came out and played solos. And he could be a difficult man to get along with because he was so much better than most of the musicians that he ever played with. And he could get very angry if they didn't live up to his standards.
I think it's an interesting statement you just said, that he considered himself an artist from the beginning.
Oh, yeah.
You know, jazz wasn't necessarily recognized as an art form.
That's right.
Until much after that.
Yeah.
But he always had enough respect for his own ability.
Yeah, he felt it was a very special way of playing music. And that experience of going to Europe in 1919 and playing in concert halls, giving a command performance for the king in England, dressed in a tuxedo, it made a tremendous impression on him all the rest of his life. Mm-hmm. And he started, in the 30s, started writing classical pieces, you know, and ballets and things. And he wanted the music to be taken seriously, you know.
Was he mostly self-taught?
Yeah, totally self-taught.
Yeah.
You know, he stole his brother's clarinet and started practicing by himself. He says, you know, I didn't have any money to buy reeds. He says, I'd make my own reeds out of matchboxes. carve them out of matchboxes, you know.
Wow.
Yeah, he left home when he was like, he started playing professionally at 10, left home when he was 14. He never went home again until in 1940, I think it was, when he started having teeth trouble, and his brother was a dentist. He was a wandering minstrel. He's went all over the world, you know.
Yeah.
And very temperamental, mercurial. He could love you, give you the shirt off his back, or hate you and watch out, you know.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, were there years, as with every musician, of really paying some dues for you?
Yeah, I think the early years were so exciting with the recognition with the Wildcats. And then I had my own band in Boston, 1947, 48, 49, at the Savoy Cafe, tremendously popular. It was at the beginning of the Dixieland revival and the great interest among the college kids all over the East Coast in Dixieland music, you know, and the place was jammed every night. And in 1950, George Wein started his first jazz venture, which was to open up a club called Storyville. And I had such a big name in Boston, he asked me to form the first band. By then, I had relinquished the leadership of the band at the Savoy because I felt that they were in a rut and that they weren't going anywhere, and I wanted to develop. So the band I brought into Storyville was an entirely different style band, but it featured Big Sid Catlett on drums, who I'd met when I went to Nice in 48, and he was with the Armstrong All-Stars. And Wilbur and Sidney DeParis, trumpet and trombone, marvelous pianist Red Richards, who died very recently. And I wanted to get more of a really smooth swing type beat rather than a kind of a jerky, older type beat. I was learning, experimenting, you know. So that was a great experience. And then shortly after that, I was curious with what Lenny Tristano was doing with his music. It was so different than the bebop thing, which seemed to be developing into just a formula. You know, everything sounded just the same. And the Dixieland thing seemed to be a formula. So I said, no, there's something else here. So I started studying with Lenny Tristano in the 50s, and Lee Konitz, both of them. And I finally kind of came to a parting of the ways with Lenny because he didn't want to go back any further than Lester Young and Roy Eldridge. I said, yeah, but Lenny, I mean, Roy and Lester, they came from Louis. You got to go back to Louis, you know. No, that's you don't have to go back to him.
That's interesting.
He wouldn't agree. So then I went in the Army, 52. After the Army, I formed a group with some of my old friends from the Wildcats, and we thought this whole division of jazz into traditional and modern was totally false, and it was bad, and there was elements in the old and elements in the new. It should be put together, you know. So we formed the Six, and we played a combination of traditional and bebop, really mixed together. The audience was just not ready for it at all. But we were booked into Jimmy Ryan's, which was of course, a traditional club, and we'd play something like Royal Garden Blues, but all these Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie licks, and the audience didn't understand it. Then we were booked into the Cafe Bohemia in Greenwich Village, which was the home of hard bop, where Art Blakey, and Clifford Brown, Max Roach, and those guys worked, you know. And again, we would play the same repertoire, but they disliked it for different reasons, you know. What are they playing those old corny tunes for, you know? So it was too early. It was too early to synthesize these musics.
People kind of needed to have a department to put you in in order to know how to listen to it.
But that's been a problem all my life because jazz fans do like to categorize. They feel by being able to put you into a category, somehow it shows that they're knowledgeable about jazz.
Do you have problems over the years with critics and writers who, if you're doing tributes or I don't know if remakes is the correct word, but if you're doing classic jazz that a critic can then say, well, this is pretty good, but it's not as good
Yeah.
as the original.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I've had that problem. But one of the reasons I've done these tributes and everything, I just want to somehow bring people's attention to this music. You know, you got to know about this music and hear it. And, another reason was economic, because when I started playing with a big band, using big bands, the only way you could get a promoter to book you would be to play a tribute to Benny Goodman or a tribute to Duke Ellington. Just to have Bob Wilber and his band, it's not gonna draw people. Mm-hmm. So I did a lot of these tributes. I suppose the most famous one I did was the recreation of Benny Goodman's Carnegie Hall concert, the 1938 concert. We did it 50 years to the night from the original concert at Carnegie Hall. It was note for note the same songs. We changed the order a little bit because we felt it would make it better in terms of pace. We had the same sound set up, one hanging mic and one mic on stage for Pug to use for vocals. It was totally sold out, big success. And that was one of the high points. Another high point was when we presented the world premiere of of the Queen Suite at Royal Festival Hall in Great Britain. You know, the story of the Queen Suite was that Duke met the Queen in 1957 when he was touring England. And Duke was a sucker for anything to do with royalty and all that, and he just loved it, and he thought it was marvelous. So he goes home back to the United States, and he's touring around, and he writes this work and he calls it the Queen Suite. And he goes back to New York. He goes into the studio and records it, and has one LP made and sent to the Queen. And he says in his letter, "Henceforth, this is only for your ears, Your Majesty." And he never played the work in its entirety again.
Oh my.
He would sometimes play one of the pieces, A Single Petal of the Rose, has a piano solo. So after he died, Norman Granz got a hold of the tape and issued it on Pablo. So we had this idea of doing the Queen Suite, and I was able to put the earphones on and transcribe it from the recording. You know.
I was going to say, was the music was not
No, there was
still around there?
No, we had to transcribe it from the records, you know. And we put this concert on at Royal Festival Hall, and again, the promoter notified the Queen, and she remembered the occasion, and I think was interested, and sent her daughter, Princess Anne, to the concert to represent the Queen, you know. So that was a wonderful occasion, and again, I love this music. I love to play it, but I also love the idea of people recognize this. It's America's great contribution to 20th century music, and to recognize and appreciate Benny Goodman and Duke Ellington, people like this, the way that people recognize and appreciate Bach and Beethoven and Brahms and Mozart and so forth, you know.
Do you think things seem to have more value when they come from somewhere else? That they're more exotic or something? I mean, it's pretty clear that some countries in Europe value American jazz more than we do ourselves.
I think America has always thought of culture, in quotes, as something which comes from Europe. And in America, which was a kind of a backward country and everything, when one became established in one's community as a person of substance, a doctor or a lawyer or something, and then you acquire the trappings of substance, a beautiful house and a car, and culture, which means you support the opera, you support the ballet, and in music you support the local symphony orchestra. Jazz doesn't fit into that category of culture, you know. Jazz is something. Well, first of all, it was played in New Orleans in that red light district, and all. There's something not quite respectable about it. Europeans never had this hang-up about jazz. To them, jazz was something uniquely American, and they loved it because it was so unique. You know, they never had that hang-up about it.
When was the first time you heard a big band arrangement of your own performed? And did it work?
Let me see. I think it goes back to, I think when I was in the Army in the 50s, I had a chance to experiment and write for the big band in the Army.
Yeah.
And I never knew whether it worked or not, because it never sounded as good as I thought it was going to sound, you know. And maybe this was the musicianship involved, you know. Then I used to take arrangements in to the Tonight Show band when my friend Yank Lawson was with the band, and they would, when they were taping the show, there would be a period of 5 minutes, say, while they had to rewind the tape or whatever. And to entertain the studio audience, they would want the band to play something. So they were always looking for material to play. So Yank says, well, you know, write some things and bring them in, and the band will play it, and you can get an ASCAP credit, you know. So I began to write things, and it was pretty much a case of the guy's sight reading. And they began to sound a little better, because it's a good quality band, you know.
Yeah.
So, but it wasn't until a couple of years ago that I really got a chance to do a whole CD of my arrangements.
Right.
And some of these arrangements I'd written 20 years ago and never really had them played,
my.
you know. Yeah.
That must have been interesting to hear them after all that time.
And the band was made up of a lot of great players, but we had a 3-hour rehearsal on a Saturday morning and a 2-hour concert that afternoon. And the playing was so good that we could issue the CD with the numbers played on the CD exactly like we did in the concert. And of course, Pug sang some marvelous songs on it. I had some of my Ellington transcriptions and Goodman transcriptions. Yeah, I felt good about doing that.
Yeah. You finally got to play with Benny Goodman in the 50s?
I played with Benny in the late 50s when he was putting together a band to go out on the road. And I just went up, and the word was out, Benny's auditioning up at the studio, and I took my tenor and went up, and he liked my playing. So, so I did one tour, and then I did another tour the next year, and got to know Benny, and he seemed to like me. I never got the Ray, the famous Goodman Ray, and I didn't get much chance to play clarinet in the band, I must say. It was mostly tenor, but it developed a lifelong friendship with Benny, and he used to call me and say, hey, kid, what are you doing this morning? Come on out, let's play some duets. So I go to his apartment, and we play some Mozart clarinet duets and things. Interesting man. One time he called me up and said, I'm going into Basin Street, and I want to do some of the sextet things from the 40s, but I don't have any arrangements on them. So come on up, maybe you could, you know, write some transcriptions from the old records. So we're listening to some of the 1940s stuff, you know, with Cootie and Georgie Auld, and he's listening. He says, yeah, geez, I can't play that way anymore. And I was like, suddenly he let his hair down and said what was true, and he knew he couldn't play the way he did then, you know. It's kind of sad.
Yeah. If you, for some strange reason, let's suppose I was a doctor and gave you some advice like, you have to give up all your instruments except one, what would you, God, what would you choose?
Geez, I don't know. if my wife had any say, she'd say, give up everything but that straight soprano.
Oh.
And that's the one she loves.
Yeah.
I'm loath to give up the clarinet because it's the most difficult by far.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a great challenge to try to play that clarinet. But I suppose that in the interest of my sanity, if I had only one, I think I'd give them all up except that straight soprano.
Yeah. I think you're needed on that instrument in these days. My own opinion is that, you know, there's an awful lot of contemporary jazz happening out there where the soprano has come into favor as a hip-sounding instrument.
That's right.
But the music that surrounds it
the concept is entirely different than anything that I ever heard on the instrument. And I mean, I listened to Kenny G. How can you help but listen to Kenny G? Every time you pick up a phone and you put on hold, there's Kenny G. And it's just completely foreign from the sound that I hear in the instrument. I appreciate Coltrane, what he was trying to do with it, but to me, that's not the sound that I like at all.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Bechet got this soaring singing quality in his playing. And while I don't use the same intense vibrato that he does, because that's him, it's not me, but that the intense lyricism of his playing, just nobody has really approached him at all. He's still the master, the most exciting soprano player. Yeah.
I brought a couple short pieces of music in.
Oh, yeah?
I thought maybe we could just see what your comments might be on. I guess you've heard this before.
Yeah. Well, I knew that record when I was still in high school listening to early records, but I was called on to do the scoring for a picture about Bix Beiderbecke called Bix. And it was done by an Italian film company. And so Pug and I went to Rome. We had conferences with Pupi Avati, who was the director, and his brother Antonio, who was kind of the business head of it. Pupi played clarinet in college and had his own Dixieland band, and it had always been his dream to make a movie about Bix. So it was a very exciting project. So I assembled a band that included Italian musicians, Americans, and English, and we spent a week in Rome recording the soundtrack. Well, this was after many conferences when we decided to pick out which songs to do, you know. One of them was definitely going to be singing the blues, you know. So the question was, who would play the C melody solo, Frankie Trombauer? Well, I chose myself to do it. So I actually borrowed a C melody saxophone from a student of mine in Chipping, Camden. And I practiced on that thing. And I decided, now I know why the C melody saxophone died. He says it's an impossible instrument. It goes flat on the bottom, it goes sharp on top. And so, but I worked on it enough so that I could just play a few things, and particularly that solo, to really give the feeling of Trombauer, who was a great influence in the 20s, not only on white saxophone players, but black saxophone players too. I mean, Buddy Tate talked very lovingly about the great Frankie Trombauer, you know.
As did Lester Young?
Yeah, Lester Young too. So then after I did the movie, I returned the horn to my student and said, "Thank you, Nick, and I hope I never have to play the C melody saxophone again."
I saw the movie. And, it was. I enjoyed the interaction that they portrayed between Bix and Frank.
Yeah, the movie unfortunately got some poor reviews and comments because it had so many flashbacks and flash forwards that if somebody didn't know about Bix's life, it was very confusing.
Yeah.
You know, so that was the problem. But I think we did a pretty good job in recreating the sound of that music.
Yeah.
I used Tom Pletcher on cornet, who is a fellow. His father was Stu Pletcher, was a trumpet player and arranger with. Well, he was with the Eddie Sauter band in the 30s, and Tom spent his whole life in another profession. He was a storm window salesman in northern Michigan, which is a very lucrative business in northern Michigan. Anyway, but he spent his whole life doing nothing but emulating Beiderbecke. And he's got a feeling for Beiderbecke down so that he takes any tune and it comes out like Bix would have played it, whether Bix ever played it or not. You know?
Yeah.
So he was the only choice I could think of to play Beiderbecke's part.
Yeah.
And there was other musicians that knew the music and played it with a lot of love. Kenny DeVerne played young Pee Wee Russell and Leon Rapolo. And I had a piano player from England, Keith Nichols, yeah,
Oh, Nichols.
who emulated the curious style of white piano players in the 20s, who played kind of a jerky kind of a rhythm. They all sounded like they were speeding up, and they would stop every once in a while and play some Debussy parallel ninth chords, you know. And this was before the generation of Joe Sullivan and Jess Stacy, who were emulating Earl Hines and Fats and people like that. So he did that to a T. It was perfect.
Yeah.
So, and I played Don Murray's clarinet parts too. And that was fun because Murray was a very influential and good clarinet player. Somebody who was a very important early influence on Benny Goodman.
Well, let me try another one here for you.
Yeah.
This is actually a two-parter. And then a few years later, so much for the clarinet not supposed to have vibrato.
Well, two great classic records with Sidney Bechet. The first one, of course, Cakewalkin' Babies, Sidney playing soprano. This is one of two versions that was recorded with Armstrong and Bechet of Cakewalkin' Babies. To me, the two records are among the classic records of early jazz. And it showed Bechet in 1924 fully in command of the resources of the soprano sax. Absolute command of the instrument. And Armstrong, not quite having found himself to the point that Bechet had, but still formidable. Those two records are just absolute classics. I love the song. It's interesting composition by Chris Smith, who was a New Orleans composer. I never tire of listening to those records. The interesting story about that Cakewalkin' Babies, when Time and Life were doing their series of recordings, they asked me to do the album notes for the Bechet reissues, you know. So, and they actually sat down with me and we thought about what Bechet records should be in the album, you know. So I said, well, definitely one of the two Cakewalkin' Babies got to be in there. So I was writing these notes and I was listening to that record and I said, I said to myself, I've been hearing that record since I was 15 or 16. It always sounded like there's something wrong with it. It doesn't sound right. What is it? And so I said, well, what key are they playing in? I went over to the piano, and I'm playing the record, and I said, they're playing in the key of G flat. Now, who would be playing in G flat in those days? I mean, at that tempo and everything. He says, no, well, wait a minute, what is Sidney playing? I analyzed his figures. He said, he's not playing in G flat, he's playing in A flat. This thing has been issued at the wrong speed.
Oh.
And I discovered that it probably was a flaw in the original recording when maybe there was a power outage or whatever, you know. And the whole thing was issued originally, reissued, and nobody ever picked this up. So I pointed this out to the people at Time and Life, and they said, well, we'll get our engineers on this, and you say it's an A flat. Okay, we'll make another master in A flat. So then I said, you know, the vocalist on this was Alberta Hunter. She used a pseudonym because she was under contract to another company, but it actually was Alberta Hunter. I said, Alberta Hunter is singing down in the cookery in the village. We'll take these two different takes, take it down and play it for her, and she'll tell us which is the right one. So we took it to Alberta, and they set up in the dressing room, and we played the original one, G flat, and then the new one, A flat. Oh, that's it. That's the one, you know. And of course, when you speed up a record to make it a whole tone higher in pitch, you know how much it speeds up the tempo. Mm-hmm. So it made what Bechet played on there even more incredible.
That's a great discovery.
Yeah, it was. But you know what some of the jazz critics said? They said, you're tampering with a great record. You have no right to do that, you know. Anyway, the second one, of course, was a Bechet masterpiece from 1944. 4 minutes of totally improvised blues, in which he tells his story, as he used to say when he was teaching me. He starts out with a very simple blues in the low register. Each chorus he builds, he goes up, up and up. He finally reaches the highest, one of the highest notes in the clarinet, high E flat, a huge climax, and then he ends up down in the low register again. He ties the whole piece together thematically by the phrase that he uses on the last 4 bars of the 12-bar blues. Do 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 dee da da do, la da do do. Uses the phrase every chorus, so it's improvised composition, which is to me probably the highest form of jazz playing. It's just not playing hot licks. It's just not running up one chord down another. It's conceiving the whole performance as a single piece of music, you know. One of the great classics.
Yeah.
I had an interesting experience with this piece last year when I was asked by George Wein to play a concert at Carnegie Hall in a tribute to Bechet with John Faddis and the Carnegie Hall Big Band, you know. So George's idea with this band has always been to take elements of traditional music but combine them with elements of more contemporary, you know, to make a synthesis. So I did that with this piece, and I started out the whole piece, a clarinet solo. I played all of Sidney's notes, note for note, but as the piece developed, I changed the rhythm of the band from 4/4 to 12/8. So gradually they're going, instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, and I started developing as I played Sidney's notes, and by the time I get at the last chorus, the band is going all these figures and everything. And he loved it. George said, "That's great." I mean, it was a combination of the old and the new.
Sounds marvelous.
So I've had a lot of fun with that piece.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One more quick one.
Okay. that's well, Summit Reunion, which is
Yeah.
our later name for Soprano Summit, Kenny
Right.
DeVerne and myself.
Yeah.
It's a piece we always enjoyed doing by Jimmy Noon. The Apex Blues, which was named after the club where Jimmy had his group in the 20s, the Apex Club in Chicago. And Kenny's on clarinet, obviously, and I'm on alto, which is still an instrument I love to play. Interestingly enough, Johnny Hodges' teacher on alto was, well, on soprano, because he was playing soprano as a kid, was Sidney Bechet. He came to New York to study with Sidney, and Sidney was his god all his life, you know. I mean, he was a man of very few words, but he would say, you know, marvelous things about Sidney.
Yeah. So
I felt like Johnny was the first student of Sidney in 1924, 25. I was basically Sidney's second student in 1945, 46, 20 years later. And I know for a fact that many of the things that he taught Johnny, he taught me too. Yeah. So I've always loved to play the alto. I've got a new recording coming out, which I'm excited about, with Dick Hyman. It's called The Perfect Match, and it's a tribute to Johnny Hodges and Wild Bill Davis, who had a marvelous group together in a short period in the late 40s when Johnny left Duke and went out on his own. And he worked with Wild Bill and his group with guitar, bass, and drums. And Wild Bill had this marvelous funky way of playing the organ, and it brought out a side of Hodges, of that funky side of Hodges, more than Duke would bring it out. So I love those recordings, so we did this tribute to them. It's coming out very soon.
Well, we've barely touched on so many highlights of your career. I think we're going to have to do part 2 down the road. We have to, you know, I know you've done the Smithsonian and the Cotton Club,
there's so many
the
things,
Grammy and all that. And
yeah.
I did want to make note of an upcoming project that you mentioned with recording the Benny Goodman arrangements that never were recorded.
Yeah, well, this is something I've been working on. I discovered when Benny donated his music, part of it to the Lincoln Center Music Library, and then the bulk of it to Yale University. I discovered in researching the material in these two places that, and comparing them with the Benny Goodman discography, that there was many, many arrangements, over 350, which Benny had never recorded. And they're arrangements by Fletcher Henderson, Jimmy Mundy, Mary Lou Williams, Eddie Sauter, Mel Powell. All the major writers that wrote for Benny are in these things, and they were never recorded. So many marvelous vocal backgrounds that he wrote for Helen Ward, Helen Forrest, Martha Tilton. So Pug's going to be part of this project too. We found a band in Toulouse, France, called the Tuxedo Band, led by a young man named Paul Charan. This is a very exciting group of young players who are very dedicated to reproducing the sounds of the 30s and 40s. With their particular specialty is the music of Jimmy Lunsford, which I don't think there's any other band in the world today that plays the music of Jimmy Lunsford. But they have all this stuff they've transcribed off the records. They play it beautifully. So I started doing some concerts with them a few years ago, Pug and I doing Benny Goodman tribute. And they're not maybe as polished as your New York professionals, but they play the music with such spirit, and they approach it with such dedication that I find it very exciting. So Paul and I are collaborating. He has acquired some of the arrangements from Yale of these things, and we're going to spend a week, Pug and I in Toulouse, working on these things. The first part of it is to make a demo recording of maybe 4 or 6 of these things, and then we have to sell the idea to a record company.
Right.
But the beautiful thing is that the critics can't say, well, it's very good, Wilbur's does a good job, but it doesn't sound as good as Benny's record.
Yeah.
Because Benny never recorded them.
You're already over that hurdle.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Well, listen, we definitely have to get together again, but on behalf of the college, I want to thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
Congratulations on the degree.
Honored.
Which you'll
I
be getting
really am.
this weekend.
I'm thrilled.